Closed captioning as well. Welcome everyone to kickoff meeting for the working group for SIG Autoscaling and Karpenter. We have an agenda set up. I guess we've got a couple of topics already proposed. Desired output of these meetings. I guess that's mostly on myself and Marcin as the sort of people who've pushed back and suggested that we want to align on some things before we accept sort of Karpenter core being overseen by the SIG. I think from my point of view, there's the key thing is deciding on which bits of common functionality between the two, i.e. the things where both projects are trying to do the same things or trying to allow users to configure the same things, but we have at the moment potentially differing behaviors, etc. I guess anything extra you want to add there, Marcin?
Yeah, but that's more or less it. So ideally, the output of this meeting should be a kind of roadmap, how we get into one place together, what needs to be done, what is a go, what is no go, because it doesn't make sense or there is not enough resources to execute it, even if it possibly made sense. What would be the best for output for the users, how we can make sure that these two projects live happily under a single roof. So yeah, that's kind of goal. So the output, like the roadmap, commitment, and hopefully yes, decision and the end.
I'm curious just to think about maybe the constraints on this goal. Like, is the goal here to optimize for or minimizing developer effort? The idea that, we can kind of implement in one place and get twice, or is the goal more focused around the customer experience of, easing the migration of, customers who maybe want the more group-based control of Cass's approach as compared to the groupless approach for Karpenter? Like, is it more around the user experience or more around the kind of implementation and efficiency of the developer community?
So my idea for this is that we should rather optimize for the user experience, not for code portability. I'm afraid that trying to make Karpenter and Cluster Autoscaler use the significant part of shared code would be a huge effort, almost comparable to rewrite. So that's probably a no-go. Although it would be wonderful if it could be achieved, probably that has a relatively smaller return on investment, I would say. So I would rather suggest that we focus on making sure of building something that is best for the user. And if on the way we can write something once and reuse it, that's great. But that shouldn't be like the top priority. In my opinion, the top priority should be like creating a similar experience, similar set of APIs, similar expectations regarding, for example, node lifecycle and how things behave, not necessarily making sure that we have the very, very, very same code. Unless someone has some other opinion.
My only thought on that, I guess, is around backwards compatibility. I know that Kubernetes has like a very kind of strict, like if you have a CRD, there's versioning to it. You can make backwards compatible changes to it. Projects of different maturities have, Cass has no CRD, so there's essentially more of an implicit contract with customers that they'll be, forward compatible changes. How do you see that user experience kind of, is there any room for the cluster autoscaler to move on user experience? Is it more around, like, how do you see that shaking out essentially?
Okay, so so far cluster autoscaler doesn't have API per se. So it works on semi-implicit API. So you create a pod cannot be scheduled. So we try to do whatever is needed and possible within the configuration to make the pod scheduled. So that's not an API, that's a kind of contract. However, there are some ways to influence the decision. For example, how we mark pods that are being okay to be moved around, like when the nodes are being compacted, deleted, or whatever. How we make sure mark the nodes that are being deleted at the given moment, so that nothing else gets in. How we mark pods that can be kicked at any time, or pods that cannot be kicked at all. How we implement pod disruption budget, which is currently, let's say, a little bit suboptimal. So there is a set of not direct APIs that we use. These are not written in stones that can change, and in many places things could potentially converge. Let's take a look at this annotation, like do not touch you are allowed to touch this pod at will. Okay, so we've got some namespace / save to evict equals true. Okay, let's assume that there is similar functionality in Karpenter, different namespace, different name of the variable plus different value. Okay, let's say Karpenter save to move. Okay, we could create another annotation on top of the existing ones. Let's say SIG autoscaling / can allow to move equals true. That would be both implemented while still keeping the old APIs to remain backward compatible. However, we would update the documentation to drive users towards using the new annotation format or whatever mechanism we decide on for making pods freely movable or not movable at all. We've got two hands. Not sure who was first. On my screen, yeah, Jack is first.
Cool. Yeah, I wanted to bring up, I think one concrete low-hanging fruit we can tackle is making sure, in terms of user migration between the two, is making sure that we have end-to-end tests for a single sort of, dynamic cluster configuration, and then we can go back and forth. I mean, we really should be able to run Karpenter and cluster autoscaler side by side, but we should also be able to very easily tear down Karpenter and do something similar with cluster autoscaler, and then tear down cluster autoscaler and do something similar with Karpenter. So again, this is like a sort of low-hanging fruit problem, but I think it would be critical that we don't get ourselves into a situation where you need like a different type of Kubernetes cluster to run cluster autoscaler versus a different type to run Karpenter. It's a kind of artificial distinction, but I think that's something that can accommodate an end-to-end test scenario and could help inform how the user experience is unified between the two. Essentially, it's like Kubernetes is here, and then your autoscaling solutions are here, and they can be both complementary. You can switch them out. Like, does this make sense what I'm saying? Does that sound like a concrete item we could
yeah, to some extent yes, to some extent no. So the reason why it may be troublesome is that there is different underlying infrastructure model down below Karpenter and cluster autoscaler. So cluster autoscaler is focusing on node pools, and Karpenter is more like a unorganized node or whatever. I'm not sure what's the proper name. Let's say like we've got node pools grouped, and we've got freely roaming nodes, more or less. Okay, So you cannot take a cluster autoscaler currently as is and deploy it on a cluster that doesn't have node pools, node groups, autoscaling groups, whatever it is called in that particular cloud provider. And also, if you had node groups in the cluster, then maybe Karpenter may have some troubles adapting to it. So from that perspective, deploying same in the same cluster may not be like the end goal. What would make sure is that whatever is above that layer, let's say your deployments, your tooling, your monitoring infrastructure, the way you operate, doesn't depend on them. So that you configure your deployment in one way, you can deploy it on Karpenter, you can deploy it on cluster autoscaler, and it works without any extra adjustment and in more or less similar fashion. And you have similar expectation of what would happen next. Like does it is it clear?
Yeah, that's your response is totally clear. The last part makes 100% sense, that sharing common inputs to trigger auto-scaling behaviors should definitely be a priority. And those behaviors might be slightly different between the two, but those can be, I think that having the common inputs, like the simplest answer is just replicas with no nodes to land on. So we've got pending pods. So that's a very common input that both share, so that we would benefit by having, when we write test cases, to have a single sort of input that explodes that pending pod surface area. And then from there, we can do the cluster autoscaler behavioral validation and the Karpenter behavioral validation. But I do feel like the distinction between pools on a cluster and sort of heterogeneous sets of nodes on a cluster is not as sharp. And I think that a cluster is, if you build a Kubernetes 126 cluster, for example, and there's no pool present, then we can still run a test scenario that a pool could emerge and then be taken over by cluster autoscaler. And similar for Karpenter, if you've got a cluster with a pool on it, you can install Karpenter, and then the provisioner can then spawn its own set of heterogeneous nodes from there. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but go ahead.
So I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm saying that's probably not the goal. Like not the primary goal to make sure that on the infrastructure level it works the same. Rather above. Alice, do you want to comment on that particular thing, or do you have something else?
I guess I wanted to draw a little bit the you had mentioned like you didn't know, you didn't really like know how to describe Karpenter's heterogeneous node model like as compared to CAS, and I thought that this was actually on the agenda as well. Maybe before even getting into this discussion, there's a little bit of like groundwork and information sharing we can do, just to kind of get everyone onto the same page as the responsibilities of Karpenter as they differ from CAS, and also the places that they are the same. I also want to just comment that I think that there's probably, like, just on this topic here, the specific testing topic, I think there is likely some parts that are very shareable, like bring a deployment to a cluster. If there's enough node groups, or if there are provisioners configured, you can have a test that says, does this schedule a basic scheduling test on pending pods? But there's probably more deep behaviors and some of the more specific tests that you just couldn't share at all. To the point on like what even is Karpenter, one mental model that I didn't have at the beginning of the project but now have is that a provisioner is a node pool. But it's just under a different definition of a node pool. So Karpenter critically couples node lifecycle and node autoscaling into a single system. So with the cluster autoscaler, you have cluster autoscaler, which is responsible for autoscaling, and the node group implementation, whether that's GKE node pools or MIGs or ASGs or EKS node groups, that's responsible for the node lifecycle management, like health, repair, upgrade, etc. Karpenter couples those and doesn't give you the replica control, essentially. So You can think of Karpenter as essentially as looking at all of these options, but instead of all of these options of groups like CAS does, you look at all the options of provisioners, but instead of each of those groups being homogeneous and kind of incrementing a replica count, each of those groups is heterogeneous. And because it's the same system, it's able to make dynamic launch decisions, essentially. So you've essentially turned that, because you've coupled the system, the auto scaling and the lifecycle management, you don't need to expose that replica field anymore, essentially, because the system can make the decision itself. Now, whether or not customers actually want a replica field, that's one of our top upvoted issues on GitHub. So that's something that maybe we'll look at in the future. But I guess the point being is that if you need a way to think about a provisioner, it very much is a node pool, but it's just under a slightly different definition, essentially. But for example, you can apply a taint to the provisioner in the same way you can a node pool. All the nodes will get the taint. You can apply labels or requirements, but instead of them being identical instance types or identical machine types within that node pool, they're flexible within a set of requirements that are dynamically selected at runtime.
Okay, very, very good to know. You still have your hand risen. Okay, Maciek.
Thanks. So I have a few comments. Let me first sort of refer back to like the ongoing discussion before I start a new topic. So I think one thing to note with cluster autoscaler is also that obviously it's the most natural way for one node group in cluster autoscaler to match to one ASG or something, but it doesn't actually need to, right? It's just an internal autoscaler concept. There is nothing stopping anyone from implementing a cloud provider implementation in CA, where a single node group in CA is backed by multiple ASGs, or a single ASG is somehow spread into multiple node pools, or even there are no ASGs at all. You could write a cloud provider that just creates nodes, and then the concept of node group really just becomes a shape of node that you're creating, and you can again have multiple. And for example, like that's how it works in GKE, where a node pool is really a few node groups in CA. So it's possible. Just kind of side note. So you could do this, but I think Alice had a good point on the responsibility, right? In cluster autoscaler model, it's still node group is really, I think, the configuration of the node group is basically outside of cluster autoscaler API. Cluster autoscaler is managing the size or creating and deleting VMs, not necessarily configuring them. And Karpenter is like taking more responsibility. But I think there is a lot in this purely auto-scaling space where we can still try to make things portable and easier for the users. Some examples were already given, right? So things like shared annotations, making sure we interpret scheduling constraints similarly are the most obvious ones. But I think there are both functional things, like for example, how we handle daemon set on node deletion. That's kind of very impactful for networking, for behavior of various daemon sets and services. And this isn't inherently tied to any particular provisioning model, and just having compatibility and similar set of choices in those sort of areas, I think would just make user experience much easier. And finally, I think on top of existing features like this, where we could discuss how we can try to bring them closer and make the experience more consistent, there is also an potential to collaborate on future features, future problems that I think both autoscalers will face. Like one example, for example, is PDB today limits disruption in space, or how many pods you can bring down at a given time, but it doesn't really let you do any sort of budget for how many disruptions you're going to accept over a unit of time. There is, I think, room for improvement in PDB as just one example, right? I'm not saying this is something we should do. I'm just saying if and when we get to solving those problems, if we do it together, we may come up with one solution that works for everyone and just sort of standardize, and then we don't have to deal with those backward compatibility problems down the road.
Yeah, just to plus one on that and give a little bit of insight into one of the things exactly along these lines that we've been thinking that I do think is shareable. We've talked a lot about the idea of a node disruption budget, and maybe you end up calling it something else, but conceptually it's very similar in that the premise of the idea is essentially that a pod disruption budget, if you were to run your cluster at the minimum of your PDBs, that's probably quite unhealthy. And it also requires every single application team to have correctly implemented a PDB, which we found with our customers is quite often not the case. Infrastructure teams, which is kind of the other persona in Kubernetes, may be interested in applying some sort of API or control to limit the parallelism of scale down or the disruption behavior essentially at the node level. And that's something that we've been kind of developing that I think would, that API, if we could standardize on it, could potentially apply to the cluster autoscaler as well.
If I may add, we also have like a new API, like probably the first API in cluster autoscaler that is coming, which is called provisioning request, like the API to ask to provide some form of some capacity atomically before the pods are created. That's mainly for batch AI ML use cases where you need to have either 100 nodes or nothing, and having 96 doesn't make sense. And ideally, we could possibly agree on the API and have it implemented in both ways so that like the workloads are portable. If something is written on AWS for Karpenter, it can be moved to other cloud providers like, I don't know, GKE and vice versa. That can be moved, and the API looks more or less the same, provides the same similar mechanisms, although the implementation layer is both cloud specific and autoscaler specific. But the API on top, how you request the capacity for your 100 pods with GPUs is the same. Okay, Maciek.
So I think we, like what I'm hearing, and I don't see anyone disagreeing, is that there seem to be quite a bit of areas where we think maybe we can collaborate. But I think we should maybe move on to like what are the next steps and how do we want to do it in practice, some AIs. I'm not sure what the best format is. Do we, because we have quite a large group of people here and there seem to be multiple different topics. Should we come up with some way of like subdividing this so different people can focus on different things, or do you have some other approach in mind?
And one more question is, we don't want you to block you anyhow. So are there any time constraints, commitments, I don't know, cross-company agreements whatsoever that we may want to be aware of that would potentially block your, I don't know, you need to have a yes, no decision quicker or whatever, anything like that?
Yeah, hey, so I'll take this and use this as an opportunity to also introduce myself. My name is Alex Kessler. I'm a product manager with AWS, specifically over EKS's compute features and products. So to be very direct, no, there is not any like specific time commitments that we have that we're working as, but I think there is one very important change coming to the project that to us is a very important milestone, and one that would sort of by definition limit our ability to make changes in the future, which is the graduation of Karpenter's APIs to V1 Beta 1. And I would really love to get as much of this discussion to bed by the time we start putting those API changes out in the product. because by virtue of the the beta API, I don't know, lifecycle stage, we can't. We're going to start to have very few opportunities afterwards to make meaningful breaking changes. So that to me is the biggest constraint over what we're able to do here. That being said, there's nothing. We're still in the process of formulating what changes are necessary, particularly breaking changes between now and V1 beta and then V1. So I think this is a really like ripe opportunity for us to kind of put the right API formats and schemas in place to achieve this kind of alignment that we're talking about.
Cool. Thank you for this information.
I'd love to have
Yes.
our beta, essentially our beta API, which we're graduating our V1 Alpha 5 API. We should do a review with this group minimally, just to kind of educate you guys on what we see as our potential V1 API, including things like naming, etc.
Okay. Jack, I guess.
I just wanted to give a quick vote for doing things right and not doing things rushed. I think that's what we're doing here. So lots of folks would love for this to happen yesterday, but those folks can wait because we haven't done it right yet. So let's do it right. I love Ellis's idea of doing a API audit knowledge dump. I don't think there's a risk there. I don't think that surface area is likely, based on what we're talking about now, likely to require changes, but certainly a great call out. And I would definitely defer to the Karpenter maintainers to say that I'm totally wrong.
Okay, so what's next on the agenda? Next steps or no?
I think one question I had is how do we know that we've identified all potential areas for this convergence? Like there's obviously we spent the last 30 minutes talking about all of the sort of relatively obvious areas, annotations, behavior around certain kinds of corner cases. Do you think it would be worthwhile to put the question to the community more broadly, to solicit other like kind of subject areas that we should be thinking about? Because in my mind, the high level process here is identify areas for convergence, prioritize them, and then work through them this is my product manager hat speaking, work through them in the order of importance and identify whether or not these are areas where there is practical convergence or there isn't, and then start working on the implementation or technical decision making that needs to happen there. I worry that we will necessarily be biased by where our interest lies in sort of these smaller groups, and it'd be worthwhile to kind of get the broader community's feedback on where they see opportunities here as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like broader community feedback would be great. I'm not exactly sure how to do it at this moment. Might be possible, I don't know, at KubeCon to do some bigger sessions, polling, discussions, or whatever. SIG Autoscaling attendance is more or less the size of this group. So you will not get significantly more voices. We could definitely ask people on the call to provide their feedback, ideas for conversions, whatever. However, it's not like an order of magnitude bigger group. Order of magnitude group would require some polling, either customers on your side, my side, I mean Google side, or other way, or you're using KubeCon or events like that to gather more people in the room and hear their voices and concerns. Unfortunately, KubeCon is in November, so at this moment, I am not sure how can we get, I don't know, 200 people to get their feedback, but I am definitely open for the suggestions.
I won't jump the raise hand queue. I'll let everyone else weigh in, but I have some ideas.
Okay. On my screen, the order is Maciek, Elis, Guy.
Okay. I've seen GitHub issue being suggested, and that seems like an obvious one. I think we may want more channels. Not sure what the best is, but I was thinking, should we also create some sort of shared document with everyone here so we can like put our ideas offline? I'm not even thinking about reviewing them at this stage, more kind of brainstorming where everyone can put their ideas, and just so in this group we can work offline and not just during the meetings. And I don't know if it helps or if it actually sabotages getting opinions from community. I'd imagine in many ways it's easier as a user to basically see a list of ideas we already have and then have a chance to speak which ones are the most relevant. But I also acknowledge that may sort of limit creativity, because if there is already 20 things there, the chances are I'm just going to limit myself to those. Still, I think, yeah, doing maybe one list, I don't know what the best format is, some sort of document with ideas we have. If nothing else, we could do this in parallel with gathering any other feedback, so we don't do it sequentially, basically.
Elis, you were the next in line, but you lowered your hand.
I ended up just saying it in the chat. We have a habit of making laundry list GitHub issues, just where we can kind of dump a bunch of ideas. It gives folks an opportunity to upvote or downvote. It's maybe slightly less flexible than a Google Doc, but has more visibility because it triggers GitHub notifications. But we maintain these documents over, like, I think this one is like years old. Maybe not years old, it's maybe a year old. But that's worked well for our community. And the other thought is, like, in terms of the size of the audience, the Karpenter community is, like, we often get around this size in our own working groups, depending on which one it is, which hour it's at. But I suspect we should be able to get a pretty sizable group with different perspectives to give feedback if we do something asynchronous.
Okay. Guy?
Yeah, I think we can use from the SIG Autoscaling side, at least, we can use Slack and the mailing list, although it's not often used these days. Maybe that means people will pay more attention to it if we actually send out an email requesting people weigh in. But yeah, I think there's like, we could wait to KubeCon. I feel like that we should be able to get enough feedback from the community significantly before then, given how far out it is and stuff. Yeah, I think there's a number of channels we can use to get us a representative sample.
Alex, as far as I remember, you said that you wanted to say something.
No, I think this all makes a lot of sense. We've had, Ellis kind of touched on it, a fair bit of success leveraging GitHub as sort of a, not just a like code contribution and like reviewing platform, but also just like community feedback platform. And whether or not that's an abuse of like a GitHub issue versus a like a bug report, it's something I'll leave for another day. But I would definitely propose GitHub as a good way to do this. The mailing list, I like the idea of that as well. Guy, I assume there's a fair amount of people on that list, right? And maybe an email coming out that isn't an event invitation like for the working group, but something else, especially if it has a pointer to a resource that they can kind of browse outside of their like email habits, that could be really helpful. So I also agree that I think that we should likely be able to get the feedback that gives us the confidence to say, here's the definitive list of what areas there are where we can converge these things before KubeCon seems pretty realistic. I also do want to be cognizant of the fact that it is the summer, and unlike many Americans, many people in other parts of the world take long, very pleasant vacations. and that we should expect a bit of a decline in sort of engagement as a result.
Okay, and there is one more item on the agenda. I guess it's Alice. Have you covered it already, or you wanted to say something more?
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit earlier, just like the kind of dual responsibilities or the expanded responsibilities of Karpenter. And it actually sounds like, just hearing about your new API, which is news to me, around the manual node provisioning or the static capacity provisioning for CAS. It seems like you may be also moving in the direction towards doing more node lifecycle management, maybe not all the way to the point of, node upgrade, et cetera, but there's kind of an increase in scope that's happening. Maybe just to close out on this topic, though, are there any other questions you have around how Karpenter sees these responsibilities, or what the project does, or any kind of education that we could do to just help understanding?
Yes, probably we don't know a lot about Karpenter, at least me myself, and it would be great to have more ideas. Possibly not at this very moment. Right now we are agreeing on, let's say, ground rules, but later it like sharing knowledge would be very beneficial. Part of the story why cluster autoscaler doesn't have this life management is what that to some extent cluster autoscaler was driven by Google to the same extent like Karpenter is driven somehow by the things works on AWS. So node lifecycle management was built on a different layer. So we didn't have a strong incentive to build it there. However, nodes that are not working or have troubles are prioritized for being deleted in cluster autoscaler. So there are some touches of node management there. However, this was explicitly not done there because some other teams at Google decided that they want to do it separately. So we built cluster autoscaler in that responsibilities, and in many cases, like the community followed and no one had any strong opinions against it. So this is more or less how it is. Like the same, for example, with node pools, mix, and so on. So at the very beginning of Kubernetes, it was initially built, let's say, to run on Google, and at Google we had managed instance group. Managed instance group team was sitting next to us, so we decided that we go with managed instance group, and it made sense. We didn't like investigate all possible options and create all the possible implementations. We created, I mean, Google, the one that makes sense at this moment. So there is like a lot of legacy and corporate-driven decisions in the design to some extent. But yeah, we are open to re-evaluating things if needed. Like we build it, what makes sense to us, and no one objected, and somehow the community followed. So many things are the way it is. However, these things can be moved and altered, possibly.
Are you suggesting something like a GCP provider for Karpenter?
Sorry?
Just to understand you there, are you suggesting something like a GCP provider for Karpenter being something that might be interesting to be developed, or more that the responsibilities of CAS growing?
No, rather the responsibilities. So at this moment, at least Google teams are heavily invested into cluster autoscaler and all the environments there. from that perspective, it is unlikely that any like significant work on Karpenter provider for GCP would be funded on our end. Of course, we cannot prevent others from building it. Like it's open project. If someone comes to you, then yes, it is. However, at this moment, I think it's not very likely that we would be able to staff the effort to build anything super significant on Karpenter. And it's like maintaining it is a non-trivial commitment, and having two is probably not a thing that we could do in a longer run. So from that perspective, for Google doing GCP port on Karpenter, the answer is probably not. Don't quote me like super officially, but that's the way it is. However, if someone decides to build it and supports, we as a company will provide some guidance, feedback, whatever is needed to make them successful. However, we will probably not put, I don't know, 5 engineers to build the support, at least not at this moment.
I know we did have a community member 6 months back or so that did try to do it, but there was, I think they encountered an issue with the GCP cloud provider, or maybe the GKE cloud provider implementation, which for a node to join a cluster, it had to be part of a MIG, which was one of the constraints that they found, which required, like they had to go through the MIG API essentially in order to have the node register. And I think they ended up giving up on the GCP provider, and I wouldn't state it as like an explicit goal of something that we, need to have happen for Karpenter. I think if CAS is working well for your customers, that's awesome. But is something that we may that's just the kind of detail we may find, especially as Karpenter continues to see support on other cloud providers, as we may see folks asking that question again.
Mm-hmm. And part of the problem is like the rest of ecosystem that depends on node pools. So these are like connected stuff. So from that perspective, it would be rather hard for us to significantly change things there. But yeah, we'll see. Maciek.
Sort of going back from the detailed discussion of specific providers, I think even in cluster autoscaler, how you initially configure it is different on different clouds. Like setting up cluster autoscaler on, say, GCP self-hosted versus GKE versus Azure versus AWS versus whatever other provider you're using is going to be quite different. For Karpenter, obviously, it's harder to say because I think there aren't other providers. I haven't been able to see how a provisioner looks like on different clouds. But I think the point is, even if the initial setup and configuration is different, I'm not sure how easily it's going to be to cross that. But then I think focusing on once I have Autoscaler running, basically the pods are portable, the workloads are portable, and the user experience is similar, would already solve a lot of issues, right? Because the configuration, Autoscaler configuration, is hopefully a one-time thing or something you don't change all the time. And having portable workloads, I think, would already be a very good achievement. So I guess my point was, I think maybe that's where I would initially focus, and then things like provider integrations is maybe an interesting topic, but I would say a lower priority for me at least.
Cool. I guess on action items, as we're heading towards the end of the hour, I think this has been really useful. So setting up a recurring meeting series at this time every week, if people don't object, going forward. I think fairly persuasive on the GitHub issue for sharing ideas async, and I think we can also use that to pin down exactly what our criteria is in terms of agreement as to when we're willing to sort of take on adopt cluster Karpenter core into the SIG or not, and then I think probably one meeting each from the Karpenter team and the CA team on sort of Karpenter API review and the CA features and roadmap going forward. Email SIG Autoscaling mailing list to ask users of the CA to weigh in on the GitHub issue. Anything beyond that? I think to answer your question, Maciek, I think create a new one under probably under the Kubernetes Autoscaler repo. And then we can loop back round to the, we can just link it into the existing issue for those who are wanting to weigh in.
Sounds good.
And I think we pretty much have signees for all of those. So I think Karpenter team can organize async amongst yourself as to do we want to run next week's meeting as just this, or again with an agenda that people can stick their ideas into, or do we want do you think that's enough time for you to prepare a sort of Karpenter API review, or vice versa?
Yeah, I did want to question a little bit the weekly cadence. I know maybe it makes sense to do more ad hoc for each of these follow-ons. Specifically, I know Jonathan is neck deep in the V1 Beta 1 design review, and that's probably, I don't think, Jonathan, maybe you can speak up, but I think Monday next week is probably pretty aggressive to have anything polished.
Yeah, that's too, yeah, it's probably too aggressive.
But maybe like the GitHub issue is something that we could discuss sooner. I think that the slot generally works well for the team. If that works well for you guys, I know it's you're up late. Appreciate staying up for us. But maybe we could kind of use the slot if it makes sense to use. But maybe we won't have, like, maybe particular action items will take longer than the week. Though I'd just be cautious about like the not having, like, you know, getting everybody up and making this time and then not having an agenda for the meeting.
Yeah, I guess we can set up a weekly cadence, have the agenda running with people able to put it in, and if we don't have any agenda items for the week as of Friday evening EU time, we just cancel it for a given week. I guess one thing for ease of communication, do we want to get a dedicated Slack channel set up on the Kubernetes Slack?
We could think about using the Karpenter dev channel. I know it's quite a bit lower traffic. The Karpenter channel is like the customer facing one, and then there's a Karpenter dev channel, which is fairly low traffic we could repurpose for now. The customer facing one is much higher traffic. I think we should avoid that one. But as far as I understand, CAS only has, or the SIG Autoscaling only has one channel. There's no Autoscaling dev and Autoscaling.
No, we have another one for API related discussions, but that's very low traffic, and also like that's HPA basically, not sort of cluster autoscaler. I mean, it should be easy enough to set up a dedicated one if we want it. Otherwise, if you're happy for us to use/abuse the Karpenter dev one, happy enough.
If a new channel is easy, I think we should just keep this clean.
Yeah, ditto.
I want to just offer a voice of dissent, and then we can all discuss async how to figure it out. The reason not to do that is it sort of closes the community of discussion to this group right now. So do we want to do that? If we do, then that would be a good way of doing that. If we want this working group to be a sort of living organism in terms of welcoming folks to it as they land in the sort of communication media that tell them that this exists, like they may have been on vacation for the last 2 weeks as this emerged, then I think doing it in the vanilla autoscaler Slack would be the most, it'd be the best way to broadcast that these conversations are going on to the existing autoscaler community. So that's just something to consider. Whereas the private Slack channel gets us a nice clean room where we're not distracted, but at the exclusion of letting folks know outside of this core group what's going on. So
I had certainly been considering a public channel that we then certainly drop pointers to all over the place. So in like the customer facing Karpenter channel, Karpenter dev, SIG Autoscaling mailing list, SIG Autoscaling Slack channel. Like I was not thinking of anything private.
yeah, for sure. I don't think anybody's thinking private. It's more, do you want to be as obvious and broadcasty as possible or not?
Yeah.
There's definitely a cost to that.
Yeah. I know, Guy.
I think my preference is still for a dedicated Slack channel and just communicate it as widely as possible.
Yeah.
Awesome. I can take that as an action item as well. Awesome. I think this has been really useful. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending and all your input. Sounding positive. So I will set up recurring meeting and Slack channel and let everyone know when that's done. We can take it from there.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.